Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another program on the miracles of the book Genesis. We have been studying the second part of Genesis, where we find the miracle section. And in the last weeks and months, we focused on the fluids in order to understand the phenomena of the so-called supernatural that we found out can actually be completely explained with the help of the divine, of the natural law. And so consequently, what was deemed to be a miracle in the distant and maybe not so distant past, thanks to Spiritism and the laws, the spiritual laws, we've learned that miracles actually don't exist. All these so-called miracles can be explained. And in the last few weeks, we focused on the miracles in the gospel, which is part of chapter 15 in Genesis. And today we will continue with different cases. One is called the withered hand. Then we will continue with the stooped woman and the paralytic by the pool. And we will go over those healing events and explain with the help of Genesis what actually happened behind the scenes. Before we go into the text, I want to say welcome to everyone who is here. Thank you so much for joining. Tony, it's a pleasure. And before we go into the actual study of tonight, we're going to share our screen and we will just for a few minutes go back into the mechanisms, so that for those of you who've been here before, it's just jogging your memory. But for those of you who've joined freshly, you will be better able to follow along. So let us go into slideshow mode. And here we go. So I'm trusting that you can see it. So far, it's always worked. So what is healing? Healing is replacing an unhealthy molecule with a healthy one. It's just like with our thoughts. If we have unhealthy thoughts, it's very difficult to drop a thought. But replacing one thought with another is the most effective way. Same with healing. The diseased person has unhealthy fluids in his body. It's the fluidic body, which is the perispirit, is affected. And those unhealthy molecules will be replaced with healthy ones in primarily two distinct forms. Now let's look at those. Number one is the following. Here, the driving agent is either a discarnate or an incarnate spirit, which injects a portion of the substance of the perispirit into the deteriorating body. That is exactly that replacement of the unhealthy molecule with the healthy one. Here, the curative power lies in the purity of the injected substance, the purity of the injected fluids, the energy of the will of the discarnate or incarnate spirit, and the intention of the discarnate or incarnate healer spirit. Okay, so the movement is from here out, and it's called Allan Kardec coined it the so-called force pump. The second major way of healing is, again, one fluid, the bad fluid, the unhealthy fluid, gets replaced with a healthy one, is the so-called suction pump, according to him. Here, it's just a normal fluidic radiation. In the case of Jesus, he was at a certain place. He was minding his business. He was dealing with the crowds and did not have any intent to heal the woman who was bleeding, who had been bleeding for 12 some years. There was no intent. He didn't even know her. There was no willpower involved on his behalf. But though in this case, the woman who was bleeding, she had such an ardent desire and such a strong faith to heal that she took the fluid from Jesus. Now, it doesn't always have to be Jesus, of course. This is a general motion. It's taking from an incarnate or discarnate healer spirit, versus the other one is intentionally giving to the sick person. Of course, here too, the more pure, more evolved the spirit is, the more potent the healing qualities, because the replacement of the unhealthy fluids with the healthy ones are more effective when the fluids are more pure. And then we often encounter both actions at once, the force pump and the suction pump. So it's not always either or. So the healing action can either be slow or with prolonged treatment. So it's repetitive. The client has to come back, or it can go quick like lightning, like an electric current. And again, if the intention, or if in case of Jesus, of course, the power, the force was so strong that in his case, most healings appeared to have happened instantaneously. So all healings are varieties of magnetism. The only difference is in the intensity and in the speed. I apologize. So the fluid performs the role of therapeutic agent with its effects. So the replacement of the unhealthy fluid with the healthy one, is the action. So it is the fluid that performs the role of the therapeutic agent. And again, the effectiveness depends on the quality of the fluid and circumstances. All right, dear friends, let us go out of this PowerPoint. And here we are. Teresa, hello, dear friend. Thanks for joining. Nora Brazil, thank you for joining. So lovely to have you here. So now let us turn to Genesis. And we will continue with the withered hand. We find it on page 326. All right, here. At another time, Jesus entered the synagogue, where he found a man who had a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see if he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they would have a reason to accuse him. We remember that on the Sabbath, the Jews were not supposed to do any work. He said to the man who had the withered hand, "Get up and stand there in their midst." Then he asked them, "On the Sabbath, it is permissible to do good or evil, to save life or take it? ? Is it permissible?" he asked the group. They remained silent. However, looking at them with indignation, he pitied them for the blindness of their hearts, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it became whole. Immediately the Pharisees left and held counsel with the Herodians against him, as to have to cause his downfall. However, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, to where a large crowd of people had followed him, from Galilee and Judea, from Jerusalem, Idumea, and from beyond the Jordan. So, this particular case is taking place on a Sabbath. And Jesus, courageous as he is, asked them, "Can we perform good or evil acts on a Sabbath?" And everyone was silent. Nobody dared to say anything. And he healed this man. His withered hand became whole. And what did the Pharisees do? They rushed to their council and talked about bringing down Jesus. So not much has changed between our days today and back then. It may not be religion through which people are persecuted, and even the governor of this planet. So how can we be surprised if persecution happens today too? Maybe in different forms and shapes. Maybe it's political persecution. Who knows what all the different forms and shapes. But it is still going on. So before we talk about that, because Alan Kardec adds another healing story before he gives us an explanation, and we will do the same. And that is the stooped woman. Jesus taught in the synagogue every Sabbath. So again, he is on a Sabbath. And of course, he's doing that for a good reason, right? He's teaching everyone a lesson. One day, he saw a woman possessed by a spirit who had made her infirm for 18 years. And she was so stooped over that she could not look up at all. Upon seeing her, Jesus called to her and said, "Woman, you are free of your infirmity." At the same time, he placed his hands on her, and she immediately straightened up and gave thanks to God. But the head of the synagogue was indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he said to the people, "There are 6 days meant for work. Come here on one of those days to be healed, and not one of the Sabbath." So lots of rigidity, right? The Lord then said to him, "Hypocrite, which one of you does not untie his ox or donkey from the manger on the Sabbath to lead it to drink? So why should this daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 years, not be freed on the Sabbath from her bonds?" Good point, right? If the Jews were untying the ox to allow it to drink water, why shouldn't she be untied of her suffering? At these words, all his adversaries became confused, and all the people were thrilled at seeing him do such glorious things. And that's in Luke. The former one, by the way, we can find in Mark. The withered hand is in Mark 3, verses 1 to 8, and this is Luke 13, 10 to 17. So both cases take place on the Sabbath. So here Alan Kardec adds his explanation, and he says, these incidents show that at that time, most infirmities were attributed to a demon, and that as today, possessions were confused with illnesses, but in a reverse sense, and that is, nowadays, those who do not believe in evil spirits, confuse obsessions with pathological illnesses. So here too, things have not really changed. How many psychological disorders are being treated physically and are not recognized as a problem of obsession? And that is today. And back then, most infirmities were attributed to demons. So it's just reversed, but it's still the same mechanism, right? So obsessions do play a huge part in illnesses. So in other words, that's all what Alan Kardec adds to these two cases. That both the withered hand as well as the stooped over woman, even though these are physical manifestations, and this is just for us to kind of open up our minds, he is attributing these two infirmities and these two cases to obsession. And both have reached a point where they have expiated long enough. And Jesus, of course, saw that. And so he relieved them of the spirits. He did so-called a disobsession work. So this is very interesting, isn't it? And he did it on a Sabbath. And as we move on to the next case, the theme will continue. If you have any questions, please post them, or if you wanted to add something to it, please feel free, and we'll look at it together. Okay. So the next case is the paralytic by the pool, and we may know that one too. So this is item 21. After the celebration of the Jews, Jesus went to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem was the sheep pool, called Bethsaida in Hebrew, which had 5 colonnades, where a large number of infirm, blind, and lame persons and others with withered limbs lay. So colonnades are these, I wish I had a picture. It's like these walkways, and you have these columns, right, on both sides. Maybe we know it from Roman movies or pictures from the Roman era, even the Greek era. There were always columns involved, right? And these were walkways with these columns on each side. And in those, in between, were all these people, these sick people lying on the ground or sitting on the ground. So that we have a better visual. All these people were waiting for the waters to become agitated. So they're lying next to this pool called Bethsaida, or sheep pools. And periodically, the water in the pool would get agitated. For a certain time, the angel of the Lord would descend to the pool, that was the belief, and stir up the water. And whoever entered first after the water was stirred up was healed of whatever infirmity he had. So the belief was that an angel from God was the agent of stirring up the pool water. Okay. And so then when they saw the pool being stirred up, they would be rushing in, because right at that moment, the healing qualities of the water were believed to be the strongest. Now, there was a man there who had been an invalid for 38 years. Upon seeing him lying there and knowing that he had been an invalid for such a long time, Jesus asked him, "Do you want to be healed?" It's a key question, right? Do you want to be healed? It's a question for us too, with our infirmities, mental, emotional, physical. Because remember, the healing is based on faith, intent, our will. The stronger our faith is, the more we will be able to be healed. Last week we learned that if we don't have faith, if this intent, this desire, this strong will to be healed is not present, doesn't live in us, is not alive in us, our lack of faith works like a shield against the healing forces, the healing fluids. It shields us. It doesn't allow us in. Either it shields us completely, or it slows down to a point of annulling the healthy fluids that may be available to enter us. And we certainly can't do a suction if we don't have that desire. Yes, we need to believe in it. We have to have faith. Faith is really the number one ingredient for us to heal. And that's why the question, do I want to be healed? Jesus asked him, do you want to be healed? Do you really want to be healed? And if we say yes wholeheartedly, at that moment is already an opening, right? It's a difference than when it's just an amorph thought and wouldn't it be nice? And then on the other hand, oh, it's never going to happen, right? All of that would just annul the opportunity for healing. So the invalid, it's funny, invalid. So the invalids were invalid. Interesting. So the invalid answered, "Sir, I do not have anyone to throw me into the pool after the water is stirred up. And by the time it takes me to get there, someone else gets in ahead of me." We can imagine he can't move. And so how is he going to get into the water that quickly, right? Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your mat, and walk." Immediately the man was healed, and taking his mat, he began to walk. Now it was a Sabbath day. Wow, once again. The Jews thus said to the one who had been healed, "Today is the Sabbath. You are not allowed to carry your mat." The man responded, "The one who healed me said, 'Take your mat and walk.'" They asked him, "Where is this man who told you so? Take your mat and walk?" But the one who had been healed did not know, because Jesus had withdrawn from the crowd. So this is also for us like a nonverbal lesson, right? Jesus was protesting against the Jewish rigidity of keeping the Sabbath free of any work, obviously. And we're going to talk about it. It's a form of protest. And Alan Kardec uses this exact word. He was protesting their rigidity around Sabbath. But he did not go in and set them down and said, hey, listen, you guys, I'm going to straighten you out. We're going to talk about this. You guys are wrong and I'm right. He did not confront them this way. Okay? What he did is he focused on doing the good, and then he left. And he wasn't fearful. He didn't keel over. He didn't say, oh, I can't upset the Jews because it might harm me and blah, blah, blah. And you know, I could risk my own life. No, he was courageous. And that is really an important lesson for us. It's something for us to check in with ourselves. How courageous are we to stand up for what is right? Are we courageous, or are we just going along, allowing ourselves, choosing to be bullied, choosing to keel over out of fear of loss of something? The worst loss that we always are scared of is death, right? It's losing our life in this body. So this is something for us to ponder, to meditate upon. Where are we in our courageousness, in our courage? That's really the correct word, sorry. Jesus is our guide and model, right? Afterwards, Jesus found the man in the temple and said to him, you can see that you're healed. Do not sin in the future, or else something worse may happen to you. So here, Jesus invites him to do what? He says, you can see you're healed, but don't sin again. Don't go back to your old ways. So what is Jesus inviting him here to do? Which is always our invitation for us as well. To change our ways. To do our part. In healing, we can't just walk into a healer and say, okay, do the work. No, we don't really are aligned. Our willpower isn't really engaged. We're not even really clear whether we really, truly want to be healed, which means it takes our participation. But we're expecting a miracle. How often do we walk into a spiritist center and we're expecting a miracle? And if it's not so-called miracle, right? Without us doing anything, just totally passively walking in and expecting to be healed. So this is also something for us to meditate on, because we always need to do our share. And at the very least, our share is not to go back to our old ways that caused the infirmity or our difficult situation in the first place, right? The man went to find the Jews and told them that it was Jesus who had healed him. For that reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus, because he was doing such things on a Sabbath. Then Jesus said to them, my Father has not ceased working even now, and I took work without ceasing. So this is beautiful, isn't it? And it makes so much sense. So here the Jews are persecuting Jesus. And he says, my Father, God, has not ceased working even on a Sabbath. And I too work without ceasing. He too, right? We want to be aligned with God's will. Jesus was coherent. He followed God, not him, but God to the T. God doesn't take the Sabbath off. God doesn't take a Sunday off. God doesn't take Labor Day off, right? God doesn't take any days off. So why should we? If we truly want to be coherent and aligned with God's will. And Jesus was that, to the point that led to his death. Not just that, but the fact that he was not being cooperative to the rules of the Jewish religion, the way it was practiced. It's very inspiring, isn't it? So here is now Alan Kardec's explanation, and this was in John 5, 1-17. Here is now Alan Kardec, who is giving us a longer explanation, a longer interpretation. He says, the pool at Bethesda in Jerusalem was a cistern close to the temple and was fed by a natural spring whose water seemed to have healing properties. So he's explaining how this churning, these waves, periodic waves, what the root cause of those might have been. Undoubtedly, it was an intermittent spring that at certain times forcefully gushed forth and stirred up the water. According to common belief, that was the most favorable moment for healings. In reality, it could have been that at the moment the water gushed forth, it had a more active property, or that the agitation caused by the gushing water carried minerals that were healthful for certain infirmities. So the stirring of the water could have been, or might have been, or maybe most likely was, the reason was based on an intermittent spring, according to Alan Kardec. And the belief was that when the stirring happened, that the water was most powerful. And that could be, according to Alan Kardec, could have been that the healing, the minerals, due to the stirring, were more active during that phase. And that was actually conducive to healing certain infirmities. Such effects are quite natural and well known nowadays, that certain waters under certain conditions have more healing properties than others. I'm sure you have been at waterways or you have encountered healing waters. I personally know that our local river here has very strong healing properties. People come here from all over just in the summer to lie in the river. And certain spots that have more rapids are more conducive. Then there's certain pools, there's certain spots that are just stronger in those healing properties. So it is true. I know out of my own experience, and I have some other experiences too. So such effects are quite natural and well known nowadays. But back then, the sciences were a little advanced, and supernatural cause was seen behind the majority of misunderstood phenomena. And we've studied that already. So this healing would then fall. The fact that these waters had healing properties would have been labeled a miracle, a supernatural event. And why? It's because science wasn't as developed as it is now. And as Alan Kardec explains to us, there is a more natural reason for it than a supernatural reason. Thus, the Jews attributed the stirring up of the water to the presence of an angel. And this belief seemed all the more well-founded because at that moment the water was more salutary. After having healed the man, Jesus said to him, remember? He said, go get up and take your mat. But then he found him later in the temple and he said, do not sin in the future, or else something worse may happen to you. With these words, he gave him to understand that his infirmity was a punishment. Now, let's replace that with a consequence of an effect of a cause. It was the effect of a cause that he had created. And that if he did not improve himself, he could be punished again, even more harshly. He could experience an even more harsh effect, consequence. So by saying do not sin in the future or else something worse may happen, points to the fact that the reason for his infirmity was an expiation. But as we need to do our part, right? There it is. We can't just like, okay, Jesus, heal me, and then we're going to go back to the bar and drink every night. That's exactly what, and this is just an example, that's exactly what Jesus is helping us to understand. This doctrine is in complete conformance with what Spiritism teaches, right? The law of cause and effect. We are the lawbreakers, and we create our own consequence, our own punishment. But we don't recognize it as such. We blame everyone in the world, including God, for all the hardship we experience, instead of looking in the mirror and saying, okay, my dear, you've done it unto yourself. It's taking full responsibility. We are in a phase, we are at a point on planet Earth where we're growing up. We become adults. And by becoming an adult, we need to learn to take responsibility, radical responsibility for everything in our lives. So then he says, Allan Kardec continues, Jesus seems to have taken the task of performing such healings on the Sabbath in order to have the opportunity to protest against the strictness of the Pharisees with respect to observing that particular day. So he did seem to have done it in order to protest, to show to them the hypocrisy. Yes, they're leading the ox to the water, but a person who suffered for 30-some years cannot be healed, cannot be untied from her suffering, but they can untie their ox. Again, something for us to reflect back onto our own lives. Where are we still hypocrites? Where are we still saying one thing and doing the other, and not seeing that we're not aligned? Where are we preaching that criticizing is not the way to go, and then we go around and criticize, for example, just another example. So this is really, or blaming, right? Where we're not taking responsibility. We say we are responsible, but then something happens and boom, there goes the finger, right? So he wanted to show them that true piety does not consist in observing outward practices and formalities. Rather, piety lies in the sentiments of the heart. In the sentiments of the heart. Piety lies in the sentiments of the heart. It's in our hearts. It's not in how we dress, how we sit, how many deities we have around our temple, or whatever else. What day we work or don't work. What day we worship or not worship. None of that matters, according to Jesus. What matters is our hearts. He justifies this by declaring, my Father has not ceased working even now, and I too work without ceasing. I too work without ceasing. Are we? What he meant was that God does not quit working or acting on the things of nature on the Sabbath. God does not quit on a Sabbath. God never stops working. God continues to do whatever is necessary for your nourishment and your health. And I am God's example. And that was Jesus's message. So we'll say that again because that's so important, right? Jesus expressed by healing on Sabbaths, God continues to do whatever is necessary for your nourishment, for all of our nourishment, and for all of our health. And I'm God's example. Jesus was God's example. And we are, through our many, many incarnations, working our way up towards God too, learning lessons, perfecting ourselves. So Jesus is our guide and model for that reason, because he exemplifies God in the most perfect way, and that is according to the spirits in the Spirit's book. So Any questions? No. Okay. Hi, Lucille and Nora, and Victoria Baker. Thank you. So let us continue. The man blind from birth. Well, let's see. Can we go that far? All right, let's see. Let me just see something here. Okay. So this is item 24. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind since birth. And his disciples asked him this question, Lord, was it the sin of the man or the sin of those who brought him into the world that caused him to be born blind? In other words, did he sin and get blind, or was it his family that caused him to be blind? The sins of his family. And Jesus responded, it is not he who sinned. So it's not the blind man who sinned, nor those who brought him into the world, so nor his parents. But it is so that the works of God's power might shine in him. The reason is so that the works of God's power might shine in him. It is necessary that I do the work for the one who has sent me while it is still day. While I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said this, he spit on the ground. Jesus spit on the ground, and having made clay with his saliva, he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay and said to him, go and wash in the pools of Siloam, which means sent. Then he went there, washed, and returned, seeing clearly. So this man was blind from birth, and Jesus said, here I've come to work as long as I'm still around, as long as it's still day. He spits on the ground. He follows his father's advice of always working, because he's back here on his Sabbath, I believe, right? And spits on the ground, takes the clay and rubs it on the eyes. And then he's supposed to go to the pool to wash it off, and there we go. Voila, he can see. His neighbors and those who had seen him previously begging for alms said, is this not he who used to sit and beg for alms? Some answered, it is him. Others said, no, it is someone who looks like him. But the man said to them, it is I. Then they asked him, how were your eyes opened? He responded, it was that man called Jesus. He made clay, and with it he anointed my eyes, saying, go to the pool of Siloam and wash there. I went there, washed, and now I see. They asked him, where is he? He answered, I do not know. So Jesus did not hang around. He left again. Then they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. Back to the Pharisees. Now it was on the Sabbath that Jesus had made the clay and opened his eyes. So once again, Jesus healed on a Sabbath to protest these rigid rules. The Pharisees also questioned him in order to find out how he had recovered his sight. And the man said to them, he put clay on my eyes. I washed, and now I can see. To which the Pharisees answered, that man has not been sent from God, since he does not keep the Sabbath. So the Pharisees said, that man cannot have come from God. He is not observing the Sabbath. Others, however, said, how could an evil man perform such wonders? Good question, right? Hence, there was dissension among them. Wow, so now they started fighting. One group said, how can an evil man perform such a miraculous healing? And the Pharisees, they said, can't be. He must be coming from evil because he did not observe our Sabbath. They again asked the blind man, and you, what do you say about the man who opened your eyes? And he responded, I would say that he is a prophet. So the formerly blind man sees him as a prophet. But the Jews did not believe that the man had been blind and that he had received his sight until his father and mother were called. They came, and then they asked him, is that your son? Is that your son whom you say has been blind from birth? So now the parents are in front of the Pharisees. How then can he see now? His father and mother answered, we know that he is our son, and that he has been blind from birth, but we do not know how he can see now. And we do not know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age and can answer for himself. They're referring back to their son. His father and mother spoke like this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had resolved together that whoever acknowledged Jesus as being the Christ would be thrown out of the synagogue. This is what motivated the father and mother to respond, he is of age, ask him. So again, fear, right? Fear allows us to do a lot of things that we may not believe in because we're fearful of losing a privilege, all the way down to losing our life at some point in some instances, right? So it's always fear of loss that allows us, let's put it this way, it's fear of loss where we may make a choice to go along with a program that does actually not serve us, that is not correct. Because here in the case of the Jews, the observation of the Sabbath was not really aligned with God's will. But whoever was aligning themselves with God's will would be persecuted, and they would be losing the privilege of being part of the synagogue. Now that is a big deal. If we can even imagine that back then, that was a huge punishment. That was a huge deal, to not be able to be part of the synagogue anymore. So they became politically correct in their answer. They were scared. So, do you want to become his disciples? They asked the man. His disciple? At that, one more. They called the man who had been blind and told him, render glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. So Jesus is a sinner. He responded, whether or not he is a sinner, I know nothing about that. All I do know is that he was blind, but now I can see. Oh, so they called this man a sinner. But he said, we don't know, but all we know is that he can see now. Then they asked him again, so what did he do? And he answers, I've already told you and you heard. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples? At that, they hurled insults at him and said, you can be his disciple. As for us, we're disciples of Moses. So they asked him, do you want to be this guy's disciple? He said, do what you want to do, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this man, we do not even know where he came from. Can we imagine Jesus, the governor of this planet, enduring this kind of treatment with so much humility? So much to learn for us, right? The man responded, it is really surprising that you do not know where he came from and that he opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone honors him and does his will, he listens to him. Ever since the world has existed, no one has ever heard it said that someone has opened the eyes of a blind man from birth. If this man had not been sent by God, he could not do all the things that he has done. So the blind man is really explaining his logic about Jesus and the act of his healing. The Pharisees said to the formerly blind man, you have been nothing but a sinner from your mother's womb, and you want to teach us? And they threw him out. And that is also a common thing in our world around us and in our own lives. It's like when others want to open our minds to something, we often don't want to hear them, right? So let's see what Allan Kardec is helping us to understand. This narrative, so simple and naive, bears within it an obvious character of truth. There is nothing fantastic or extraordinary about it. It is a scene from real life taken from a fact. The language of the blind man is precisely that of simple folk in whom knowledge is replaced by common sense, and who responds to the arguments of their adversaries with straightforwardness and for reasons that lack neither justice nor appropriateness. So straightforward, this fairly simple man used his common sense, since he didn't have great knowledge. He was not an intellectual, but he used common sense to speak truthfully. It is not the tone of the Pharisees, that of the proud Pharisees equal proud, who believe in nothing above their own intelligence, and who become indignant at the sole idea that the man of the people could show them a thing or two. Right? So the Pharisees were the intellectuals. They had many possessions, and they were not open to listening to a common man, having maybe more truth and common sense, or was able to share more truth than they were possessing. Being thrown out of the synagogue was like being put out of the church. It was kind of an excommunication. Spiritists, whose doctrine is that of Christ, interpreted according to the progress of today's knowledge, are treated like the Jews, who acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. And here Allan Kardec goes a little bit into a story about what we want to call the early days of Spiritism, where Spiritists were persecuted too. And he draws an analogy between Spiritists and Jews. And I let you read that by yourself. It's in the middle of page 332. But I want to fast forward and go, because that's about the excommunication, right? Why they were being threatened to be thrown out of the synagogue. And it's interesting. So I invite you to read that, page 332 in the middle. But I want to fast forward to the actual healing aspect, to the explanation. So the disciples question, what is the sin of this man that caused him to be blind from birth? Remember, that's how this particular situation, this example started, this healing. The disciple asked Jesus, what is the sin of this man that caused him to be blind from birth? And that indicates an intuition about a previous existence. Because remember, the Jews did not believe in that. So this was a novelty that Jesus brought in, the novelty of reincarnation. And when Jesus said that this was when the disciple asked this question, he was intuiting that there must have been or could have been a previous existence before this one. That's implied in that question. Otherwise, it would not make sense, because a sin that would cause an infirmity from birth would have had to have been committed before birth, and therefore in a previous existence, right? Makes sense. This question implies that there must be reincarnation, because if somebody's born blind from birth, and why would it be? It would be unjust. God is just. He's not just throwing blindness around. Oh, this person gets it and the other person gets it and this one doesn't get it, right? So it implies reincarnation. So if Jesus had seen it as being a wrong idea, this insinuation of reincarnation, he would have said, how could this man have sinned before being born? That's a question Jesus may have asked. Instead, Jesus said that the man was blind, not because he had sinned, but so that God's power could shine on him. Remember when he said that? So that God's power could shine on him. God's power could shine on him. That is, that he would be the instrument for a manifestation of God's power. So this man somehow signed up for playing this role. And to this day, we're grateful to this man who allowed himself to have God's power shine on him, because we're still learning from this particular man's incarnation, the sacrifice in a way that he brought to this world. Isn't it amazing? 2,000 some years ago, we're still looking at this man and his blindness from birth, which was not because he sinned in a previous incarnation. It was not because his parents were sinners or imposed this on him. No, it was so that he would be the instrument for a manifestation of God's power. Instantaneous healing. If this blindness was not an expiation of the past, it was a trial that would serve for his advancement, because God, who is just, would not have imposed suffering without compensation. So if this blindness was not an expiation of the past, it was a trial that would serve for his advancement. So by signing up for this trial for so many years, being blind, There's nothing lost in that, right? It served him for his soul advancement. And he offered himself to be the instrument to show how God heals through Jesus. And we know what's behind it. We know the mechanism with the fluids, right? Replacing one fluid with another. As for the means employed to heal him, it is obvious that the kind of clay made from saliva and dirt could not have had any power except through the action of the healing fluid with which it was imbued. So the clay and the water and the spit would not have had any healing properties per se, but it was through the action of the intent. What Jesus spat out, he was intent on healing him. God was working through him, with him. The intent was to replace the unhealthy molecules in him, he was blind, with healthy ones. So, except through the action of the healing fluid with which it was imbued, the clay was imbued with healing fluids. Thus it is that the most insignificant substances, water for example, may acquire powerful and effective qualities under the action of the spiritual or magnetic fluid, for which they serve as a vehicle, or if you prefer, a reservoir. So thus it is the most insignificant substances, doesn't matter what it is, can be even spit. Or he says water, that may acquire powerful and effective qualities under the action of the spiritual or magnetic fluid for which they serve as a vehicle. The spit and the clay worked as the vehicle of the healthy fluids. It was imbued by the willpower and intent of Jesus to perform a healing, and the purity of his perispirit, of the fluids, that perispiritual body of Jesus, that imbued the clay and the spit with the healing properties and replaced the unhealthy molecules in the blind man with the healthy ones via this transmission. What a beautiful story. And it's so clear for us, isn't it? Well, next week we will continue several healings by Jesus. I also may talk about next week, to go back to this case, to just talk about the Pharisees a little bit more, about how attachment to titles and intellectual qualities that we may decorate ourselves with, how that may contribute to us having a closed mind and not being open to others who may have a very important message for us. And for that, we wanted to look at Paul and Stephen, when when Paul went to Athens, and how he was treated there, versus when he spoke, passed on the good news in the small villages. And we wanted to look at the parable of the rich man and Jesus's beatitude, blessed are the meek. So we'll revisit that next week, because we're out of time. But let us just thank God and Jesus and Allan Kardec for this beautiful lesson, for this clarity, for this understanding that we reach of how the healings happen, how Jesus operated in the finest details. And thank you for being here, dear friends. Thank you for joining and sharing in this beautiful lesson. And so, God willing, we'll see you next week, same time, same place, for the continuation of our miracles. God bless you. Good night. Good night.